It was a day like any other at Harrison High, or so it seemed. The sun was shining through the classroom windows, and the usual hum of students murmured in the hallways. That is, until the bell rang for the beginning of second period. Miss Carver was halfway through explaining the Civil War when the announcement echoed over the PA system. Attention all students and faculty, please remain in lockdown position. This is not a drill. Lock all doors and stay out of sight. We will update you when it is safe. The tone in the principal's voice was colder than usual, and something about the way he said, "This is not a drill," made the hairs on the back of Sarah's neck stand up. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The entire class, once filled with chatter, now sat in stunned silence. The teacher quickly locked the door and pulled the blinds shut. The room went dark as Miss Carver urged everyone to stay quiet and still. Outside, the sounds of distant footsteps echoed in the hallways, far too deliberate to be anyone's casual stride. Sarah could feel the air in the room grow heavier, like a storm was looming. The silence that followed was almost suffocating, each second dragging on in a torturous slowness. Then the noises came. The first sound was soft, almost like a tap on the window. But it wasn't the wind, Sarah thought. She tried to ignore it, hoping it was nothing. But then it came again, louder this time, followed by a scraping sound. Someone or something was outside, and they knew the students were inside. The kids in the class exchanged terrified glances. "It's probably just a police officer," someone whispered, but they all knew better. No one spoke up. Fear had a grip on them all, as the sound continued to scrape at the window, each dragging moment becoming more desperate and erratic. Suddenly, the classroom door handle turned. The heavy clink of metal against metal made everyone's stomachs drop. Miss Carver quickly dashed to the door, peering through the small window, her breath catching in her throat. Her face went pale, and she backed away from the door in horror. "I don't know who that is," she whispered shakily before she dropped to the floor, motioning for the rest of the class to do the same. Sarah's heart was beating so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. What was going on? She had no idea what they were hiding from, but the tension was unbearable. The handle rattled again, this time more violently, as if something or someone was desperately trying to get inside. The knocking on the window intensified, followed by a low voice, one that seemed to come from nowhere. "Let me in. I'm trapped." Sarah's blood ran cold. It was a man's voice, but it didn't sound like a person. There was an unnatural distortion, as if the voice itself was altered or something else was speaking through it. A student, Tim, couldn't take it anymore. He stood up and dashed toward the door, but before he could even reach the handle, the lights flickered and then went out completely. The classroom was plunged into darkness. Sarah couldn't see anything, but she heard Tim stumble backward with a gasp, followed by an eerie, unnatural growl. Tim wasn't screaming, but something had clearly grabbed him, and Sarah knew in that moment whatever was out there wasn't human. Miss Carver whispered urgently, "Stay low. Don't make a sound." They all crouched down, huddled in the darkest corners of the room, hearts racing in collective panic. Time moved strangely in that silence. The minutes stretched into hours, but nothing seemed to change. The scraping, the knocking, the distorted voice, everything had ceased. But Sarah knew it wasn't over. Suddenly, a loud crash reverberated from down the hall. The classroom door was violently struck from the outside. Someone, something, was trying to break through. The sound of splintering wood filled the air. With each hit, the door was giving way, piece by piece. It was no longer a matter of if the door would break down, but when. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the sound stopped. The room was dead quiet again. Without thinking, Sarah grabbed her phone and texted her mom, "Something's wrong. I don't know what's happening. I love you." The text wouldn't send. The service had been cut. Her heart hammered in her chest. They were trapped. The door was now ajar, just slightly, enough for a sliver of light to spill into the room. But there was no one in the doorway. And that's when Sarah saw it, moving in the shadows. Tall and thin, its body contorted in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The figure didn't walk, it slithered, its head twitching at unnatural angles, and its eyes gleamed in the darkness. Then it spoke, but this time there was no distortion. It spoke her name. Sarah. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. There was no way it could know her name. No way. But there it was again, the voice, low, guttural, almost affectionate. "Sarah, you're next." She could feel the cold grip of terror tighten around her chest as the figure took a step closer. But just as it did, the lights flickered back on. And when they did, the figure was gone, as if it had never been there. The sirens outside wailed, and the PA system crackled back to life, announcing that the lockdown was over and the school was clear. But no one dared to move. The hallway was eerily quiet when the students slowly made their way out, unsure of what to expect. Sarah never learned who or what had been outside that door. But she did know one thing. The creature that had slithered through her school that day wasn't done with her. And it would come back when she least expected it.
Story number 2.
It was supposed to be just another Friday night at Westbrook High. The final bell had rung, and most students had already cleared out for the weekend. But something was off. A small group of friends, including Mark and Emma, stayed behind to work on a group project for biology. They sat in the quiet classroom, their eyes glued to their laptops. The building was dark, the only light coming from the flickering fluorescent bulbs above. The eerie quiet was broken only by the hum of the air conditioner and the occasional sound of pages turning. Then the lights went out. At first, they thought it was a power outage, a common enough occurrence. But when the backup lights didn't kick on, a cold unease settled over them. Mark went to check the circuit breaker, while Emma and the others stayed huddled in the corner of the room. Mark had just opened the door when he froze. The hallway outside was pitch black, but something was there. Moving, shuffling in the shadows, a figure tall and thin, standing unnaturally still, watching them. Mark could barely make out its shape, but it was clear it wasn't a student, wasn't anyone he recognized. "Mark," Emma called out from the corner of the room, her voice shaky. "What's going on?" Without answering, Mark stepped back into the room, closing the door behind him. He didn't say anything at first, but his face was pale. Emma could see the fear in his eyes. "I don't know who or what that was," he whispered. It wasn't human. The room felt even colder now. Mark locked the door. He checked the windows, each one dark and silent. The only sound was the heavy breathing of the group, all of them trying to remain as quiet as possible, as though something could hear them, something that was getting closer. Then they heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway. But they didn't sound like the steps of anyone trying to get somewhere. These footsteps were dragging, scraping across the floor with an unnatural rhythm. The lights flickered again, this time casting long, distorted shadows across the room. The scraping sound grew louder, closer, until they could hear it outside the door. One of the girls, Lucy, gasped, "It's at the door." The group held their breath. The sound stopped, and for a moment, everything was still. Then the doorknob turned. The metal clicked against the lock, followed by a soft whisper that seemed to come from nowhere. "Let me in." No one moved. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating. The doorknob rattled again, more violently this time, and the door shuddered under the pressure. "Shh," Mark whispered urgently. "Don't make a sound." They sat frozen in the darkness, the only noise now the thudding of their hearts in their chests. The whisper came again, this time louder and much closer. "Let me in." Mark's hand was shaking as he reached for his phone, his fingers fumbling to dial the number for campus security. But as soon as he hit the call button, the phone screen went black. No signal. A cold chill swept through the room, and the whispers came faster, more desperate. "Let me in! Let me in! Let me in!" The door shook violently as though something was throwing itself against it, trying to break through. Suddenly, a loud crash from the hallway. The door flew open, and in the dim light, they saw it. It was tall, impossibly tall. Its limbs were long and twisted, like it had been pulled out of shape, its body bent at sharp angles that defied nature. Its face was obscured, hidden by a long tangle of dark hair. But the eyes were the worst part. Black, empty. There was nothing in them, just an endless void. The creature stood in the doorway for a long moment, staring at them, unblinking, its mouth opening as though it were about to speak, but there were no words, just a soundless scream. The group scrambled back, pushing themselves against the walls in a frantic attempt to get away, but the creature stepped forward, its long fingers reaching out toward them. Just as it touched Emma's arm, everything went black. When the power finally returned hours later, the building was silent. No sign of the creature. No sign of Mark, Emma, or the others. The room was empty. The only thing left was a single note, written in red, scrawled on the blackboard. I'm still here. No one ever found the students. Some say they disappeared that night, taken by whatever haunted Westbrook High. Others say that when the lights go out, the creature is still there, waiting for its next victim.
Story number 3.
At Ridgeview High, there were rumors of a haunted locker room. Students often joked about it, daring each other to go in after dark. But no one really believed it. Until one fateful evening, when a group of 6 friends, tired from a long day of school, decided to test the stories for themselves. It was already late when they slipped into the gym. The lights had been turned off, leaving the room in a haze of shadows. The only sound was the echo of their footsteps on the hardwood floor. "All right," said Jason, the leader of the group. "Let's see if the locker room is really haunted or if it's just a load of crap." They all agreed, half laughing, half nervous, as they made their way to the back of the gym and into the locker room corridor. It was eerily quiet, colder than the rest of the building. As they stepped into the dimly lit space, they could almost feel something watching them from the shadows. "See? Nothing here," one of the girls, Lily, said, her voice shaky. But then, a low creaking noise echoed through the room, and the doors to one of the lockers slowly opened. No one was near it. No one had touched it. The group froze. "Did you hear that?" Jason whispered. They all nodded, their hearts pounding. Jason tried to laugh it off, but it sounded forced. "Maybe it's just the old pipes. They make weird noises," he suggested, but even he didn't believe it. Then the sound came again, a louder, more deliberate scraping from one of the farthest lockers. It was as if something was inside, trying to get out. Lily was the first to react. "I'm not staying here," she said, turning to leave. But as she reached for the door, it slammed shut with a deafening bang. The entire group jumped, and Lily screamed, her hand still on the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in. The room felt colder now, almost like ice was creeping into their skin. Jason yanked at the door, but it wouldn't open. The others gathered behind him, desperate to get out, but then they heard it. Faint at first, but growing louder. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere deep inside the locker room. And then they saw it. A shadow moved at the end of the hall, creeping along the walls as though it was trying to stay hidden. But it couldn't hide. It was too tall, too twisted. It wasn't human. The footsteps continued, growing closer, until a figure emerged from the shadows. A tall, thin man with unnaturally long limbs. His head hung at an odd angle, and his face was obscured by the dark hood of a jacket, but the outline of his body was unmistakable. Something about the way he moved made the hairs on their necks stand up. He didn't walk. He glided, as if he was floating just above the ground. The friends backed up against the door, horrified, as the figure drew nearer. It didn't speak, didn't make a sound, but its presence was suffocating. Jason reached for his phone, but as he pulled it out, the screen flickered and went black. "No signal," he muttered, his voice shaking. The figure stopped just a few feet away, still as a statue. Then, as if it were waiting for them to react, its lips parted slightly, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. A low, guttural growl escaped its throat, reverberating in the cold air. The growl was not human, not animal. It was something else, something ancient, like a sound that had not been heard in centuries. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished into thin air, leaving behind only a lingering chill. The door swung open with a force that sent them all tumbling into the gym. They scrambled to their feet, not daring to look back, and fled the building in sheer panic. They ran until they reached their cars, hearts pounding, eyes wide with terror. But even after they left, they couldn't shake the feeling that something was following them. They could still hear the scraping sound in their minds, feel the icy breath of the figure on their necks. The next day, none of them spoke of what happened. They pretended it was all just a nightmare, a trick of their imagination. But they couldn't deny that the locker room was different now. It had a sinister air, as though the dark presence had marked it. And to this day, the doors to that locker room are always locked after school hours. No one dares to go near it, except, some say, when the lights are out, you can still hear the scraping. And sometimes, if you listen closely enough, you might catch a glimpse of the figure watching from the shadows. It's always waiting, always watching for the next group of curious souls.
Story number 4.
The wind howled through the trees outside as the students of Blackwood High gathered in the library for their weekly study session. It was late, past 9 p.m., and the campus had emptied out, with only a handful of students remaining. As the storm outside grew more intense, they huddled together around the long wooden tables, trying to ignore the occasional creaks of the old building. The library was ancient, its stone walls thick and oppressive, making it feel even colder inside. Among them was a new student, Alex, who had just transferred to Blackwood. He'd heard the rumors about the library, how strange things happened after dark, how people sometimes saw things that weren't there, heard whispers in the halls, but he thought it was just that, rumors. But as the storm raged on, he began to wonder if there was some truth to the stories. It started with the books. At first, it was just an odd feeling. As Alex glanced around, he noticed that a few books on the shelves seemed off. Their spines were cracked and worn, far older than the others. But when he tried to pull one down, it didn't budge. It felt as though something was holding it in place, as though the library itself didn't want him to touch it. He shrugged it off. Maybe it was just the way old libraries were. Then the lights flickered. It was barely noticeable at first, just a brief dimming of the lights, like a soft hum that filled the room. But then it happened again, and again. Flicker, 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 like someone was turning them on and off, but nobody was near the switches. Alex felt a chill run down his spine, but the others were too absorbed in their own conversations to notice. He decided to ignore it, but something told him he shouldn't. That's when the whispering started. It was faint at first, just barely audible, like a breath in the wind. But as Alex tried to focus on it, it became clearer. The words were hard to make out, but they were definitely there, coming from the farthest corner of the library, near the stacks of old, forgotten books. He stood up, heart racing. No one else had heard it. He was sure of it. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. Alex stepped toward the sound, his legs heavy with dread, until he reached the far corner. The air was cold here, much colder than anywhere else in the room, and that's when he saw it, the figure. It was tall, shrouded in shadows, its face hidden beneath a dark hood. Its hands were long and skeletal, grasping at the shelves as though searching for something. And as Alex stood there unable to move, the figure slowly turned toward him. The room went silent, the whispers stopped. The figure's face was a mass of darkness, with no eyes, no mouth, just an empty void staring back at him. And then it spoke. "You shouldn't have come." The voice wasn't human. It was distorted, deep and hollow, like it was coming from the depths of the earth itself. Alex's blood ran cold, and before he could react, the figure vanished, dissolving into the air like smoke. The lights flickered again, and when they came back on, everything was normal. The library was empty. The books were in their places. The storm had passed. Except Alex wasn't alone. The students who had been in the library with him were gone. Their bags, their coats, everything, vanished as if they had never been there. The library was silent, but Alex felt it, the presence, like something was watching him, waiting for him. He rushed to the door, but it wouldn't open. Panic set in. He ran to the windows, but they were locked tight. There was no escape. That's when he heard the whisper again, this time right behind him, cold against his ear. "You shouldn't have come." He spun around, but no one was there. He turned back to the door. The lock clicked, the door opened. Without hesitation, Alex bolted from the library, never looking back. The next morning, Alex tried to tell someone what happened, but no one believed him. The library had been empty when the janitor arrived that night, and the storm had left no sign of anything strange. The students who were supposed to be with him, they were gone, disappeared without a trace. Months passed, but Alex couldn't shake the feeling that the library was still there, waiting for him. Every time he passed it, he could feel its eyes on him, lurking in the shadows. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind was howling just right, he'd hear the whispers again, coming from the old building. And he knew, deep down, the library was calling him back. It was waiting for the next student who would dare to enter and never leave.
Story number 5.
It was late autumn at Grayson High, and the air outside had a crisp bite to it. The trees lining the school grounds were bare, their skeletal branches creaking in the wind. Most of the students had left for the day, but a few remained, huddled in the hallways for last-minute cramming before the big math test. Among them was Emma, a senior who had always found comfort in the quiet after-school hours. Little did she know, that night would be different. Emma was heading to the library, her usual haunt when she needed to concentrate. As she walked down the hallway, she passed the old janitor's closet, the door slightly ajar. The janitor, Mr. Blake, was a strange man, always quiet, always watching. But Emma never thought much of it. Tonight, though, the faint smell of something rotten wafted from the closet. She wrinkled her nose but kept walking. When she entered the library, the lights flickered, casting eerie shadows against the bookshelves. Emma shook her head, attributing it to the storm outside. She set her things down at her usual table near the back, but something felt off. The room was too quiet, too still. She tried to push the feeling away and focused on her math homework, but then she heard it. At first, it was a faint shuffle, like someone dragging their feet across the floor. Emma glanced up, but the library was empty. Her heart started to race, and she dismissed it as just her imagination. She went back to her homework. The shuffle grew louder. It was slow and deliberate, almost like someone was creeping toward her, step by step. Emma's eyes darted around the room. There was no one in sight. Her palms began to sweat, and she felt her breath quicken. The lights flickered again, then went out completely, plunging the library into darkness. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. No answer, just the sound of dragging footsteps. Then the unmistakable sound of something heavy dropping onto the floor echoed in the darkness. The sound was so sudden, so close, Emma's heart nearly stopped. She tried to stand, but her legs were paralyzed with fear. Then she heard it again. The slow shuffle, now just a few feet away. A voice, low and raspy, whispered from the darkness. "Emma?" Her blood ran cold. There was no one else in the room. No one should have known her name. Emma's breath caught in her throat as the footsteps stopped, and the voice came again, closer this time. "Emma, come closer. I'm waiting." With every fiber of her being, Emma knew she had to get out of there. She fumbled for her phone, but when she checked the screen, there was no signal. The only thing visible was the faint glow of the emergency exit sign, casting a dim red light over the library's back door. The shuffling resumed, but now it was accompanied by soft scraping sounds, like fingernails dragging across the floor. The whispers grew more frantic. "Come closer. Come to me." Finally, Emma mustered the courage to stand and move toward the exit. But just as her hand touched the door, the lights snapped back on, blinding her for a moment. When her vision cleared, she turned around, and there, standing in the aisle between the bookshelves, was the janitor. Mr. Blake was standing perfectly still, his body twisted at an unnatural angle. His arms hung limp at his sides, and his head lolled to one side as though it was barely attached to his neck. His eyes, wide and unblinking, were fixed on Emma. But what caught her attention the most were the bloodstains on his clothes. The blood wasn't fresh, but it was unmistakable. It had soaked through his uniform, staining the fabric dark red, and when he spoke, his voice wasn't his own. "You shouldn't have come here, Emma." His mouth didn't move. The words echoed in her head, a cold, hollow sound. She backed away slowly, but her legs felt heavy, like she was stuck in place. "Now you're mine." The door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang. Emma screamed, trying to turn the knob, but it wouldn't budge. She looked back at Mr. Blake, or what used to be Mr. Blake. His figure was slowly dissolving into the shadows, his body contorting into shapes no human could make. His skin seemed to stretch, tearing at the seams, and his smile grew wider, stretching far past what was normal, revealing rows of jagged, sharp teeth. Emma's panic reached a boiling point, and in a final, desperate attempt, she threw herself against the door. It burst open and she tumbled into the hallway, gasping for air. The lights flickered once more, and when they returned, Mr. Blake was gone. The building was eerily quiet. No sounds of dragging footsteps, no whispers. But as Emma sprinted toward the exit, she heard one final whisper in her ear, so soft, so cold. "I'll be waiting." The next day, Emma didn't show up at school. Her friends tried calling, texting, but there was no answer. They eventually reported her missing to the authorities, but when the police checked the school, they found nothing. Except for one thing. In the janitor's closet, there was a fresh stain of blood on the floor. They never found Emma. But every year, when the wind howls outside and the lights flicker in the school library, some say you can still hear the dragging footsteps, the whispers, and the voice calling your name. And if you listen closely, you might hear it. Come closer. I'm waiting.
Story number 6.
It was the first day of the new school year at Everwood High, and while most students were excited to start fresh, Sarah felt a strange unease settle in her stomach. It wasn't because of the new classes or the unfamiliar faces. It was the old building itself. Everwood was a sprawling, creaky structure with long hallways and classrooms that had been around for generations. Rumors of strange occurrences had circulated for as long as anyone could remember, but Sarah had never paid much attention to them. Not until today. She had been assigned to locker number 13, one of the oldest lockers in the school. It was positioned at the end of a dimly lit hallway, far from the hustle and bustle of the main corridors. Sarah wasn't superstitious, but there was something about it that unsettled her. It felt as though the hallway itself was watching her, its shadows long and heavy, as if it could swallow her whole. She shrugged it off, telling herself she was being silly, and tried to focus on her class schedule. But as the day wore on, the feeling only intensified. Every time she passed that hallway, her skin would crawl, and she would find herself glancing at the locker, almost as though it was calling to her. The first few days passed uneventfully, but it wasn't long before Sarah noticed something odd. When she opened her locker, the air inside would feel unnaturally cold, even in the middle of a hot day. At first, she thought it was just the way the school's heating system worked, but the coldness felt different. It wasn't just a draft. It was like a presence, something that was always there, lurking just behind the steel door. One evening, after a long day of studying in the library, Sarah stayed behind to grab her things from her locker. The school was nearly empty, and the halls were silent, except for the occasional creak of the old floorboards. As she approached locker number 13, she noticed something strange. A small, crumpled note had appeared on the floor in front of it. She bent down to pick it up, her heart racing. The note was written in an uneven, jagged handwriting. "Leave before it's too late." Her blood ran cold. Who could have left this? She hadn't told anyone about the strange feelings she'd been having, and there was no way anyone else could know about the locker. She looked around the hallway, but there was no one in sight. Her hands trembled as she stuffed the note in her bag, trying to convince herself it was just a prank. But the unease gnawed at her, and the coldness in the locker only seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. Sarah began to notice other things too, small, unsettling things. Sometimes, when she opened the locker, there would be a faint scratch mark on the metal, as though something had been clawing at it. Other times, she would find her belongings rearranged, though she was certain she hadn't touched them. One night, Sarah stayed late after school, hoping to finish up some homework. The building was empty, except for a few teachers who had long since left. She made her way down the hallway to her locker, the echo of her footsteps bouncing off the walls. As she reached locker number 13, the temperature dropped, and she could see her breath in the air. She opened the locker slowly, dreading the cold that would greet her. But when the door swung open, it wasn't just cold, it was dark, like the very inside of the locker had swallowed the light. A deep, suffocating darkness, far darker than the surrounding hallway, seeped out from the cracks. That's when she heard it, a soft whisper, like a breath on the back of her neck. "Help me!" She spun around, but there was no one there. Her pulse hammered in her ears and her body froze, unable to move. The whisper came again, this time louder, more insistent. "Help me, Sarah!" The voice was coming from inside the locker. Trembling, Sarah took a step back, but the whispering only grew louder, turning into a low, guttural murmur, like something trying to speak through the darkness. "Open it!" Her mind screamed at her to run, to get out of the building, but her feet refused to move. Slowly, almost against her will, she reached for the locker door and pulled it open fully. What she saw inside made her stomach lurch. There was nothing. Nothing but the darkness, stretching endlessly, as though the locker was a portal to somewhere else. But from the depths of the dark void, a figure began to emerge. It was tall and thin, with long, spindly limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally as it crawled out of the locker. Its face was a featureless blur, a void where eyes should have been. But its mouth, the mouth was wide, impossibly wide, stretching from ear to ear. The creature opened its mouth, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. "You shouldn't have opened it." The words echoed in Sarah's mind, as though the thing was speaking directly into her thoughts. The last thing she remembered was the sensation of cold skeletal fingers brushing against her arm before everything went black. When the janitor found her the next morning, she was lying unconscious in the hallway, just outside the locker. The door to locker number 13 was closed, and everything seemed normal again. Too normal. But Sarah never returned to school. No one ever found out what happened to her, and locker number 13 was sealed off, locked tight. Yet, every few months, someone would report hearing whispers in the hallway, faint and distant, as though the creature was still calling from within the locker, waiting for the next person to open it. And sometimes, if you stand there long enough, you might hear it too, a soft whisper on the wind.
Story number 7.
It was late in the semester when the students of Maple Ridge High noticed something strange. The school's basement, once a storage area for old equipment, had been locked up for years. No one really thought much about it. That was until the day Mr. Daniels, the school's principal, made an announcement. The basement would be reopened and turned into a new student lounge. Everyone was excited, of course. A brand new space for students to hang out? It sounded perfect, but some of the older students, especially the ones who had been at the school for years, were less enthusiastic. They'd heard the rumors about the basement. Some said it was haunted, while others claimed it was cursed. They told stories of strange sounds echoing from beneath the floors, of flickering lights in the middle of the night, and of strange figures seen in the windows. But no one really paid attention to those stories until the first day the basement was opened. Sarah was one of the first students to visit the new lounge. The moment she stepped into the basement, she felt the temperature drop, like a chill had settled over her body. It wasn't just cold, it was unnaturally cold. She glanced around at the new furniture, the couches and tables set up in the middle of the room. But something didn't sit right with her. The walls seemed too dark, the shadows too deep. As she wandered deeper into the basement, she noticed a single, old wooden door at the far end of the room, partially ajar. The door was different from the others, more worn down, like it hadn't been opened in years. Curiosity got the better of her, and Sarah made her way over to the door. Her hand hovered above the handle for a moment, but some unspoken feeling, held her back. She shook it off and turned the handle. The moment the door opened, a thick, heavy air rushed past her, as though the room had been sealed off for years. The space beyond was completely dark. She reached for the light switch, but it didn't work. Her phone's flashlight was weak, barely illuminating the vast darkness inside. But even in the dim light, she could make out the outlines of strange symbols scrawled across the walls. Symbols that seemed to twist and change when she wasn't looking directly at them. As Sarah stepped inside, the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. The basement felt wrong. It was as if the space itself didn't want her there. She moved further in, ignoring the unease gnawing at her gut, and approached a large, rusted metal box in the corner. It looked like an old furnace, but it had no vents, no pipes, nothing to indicate what it had been used for. When she reached it, she felt a pulse of cold air surge from within. The box creaked open on its own, revealing nothing but pitch blackness inside. Sarah's flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw something, eyes glowing faintly, staring back at her from the depths of the box. A chill ran down her spine. She slammed the lid shut, her heart pounding. Something was wrong. Something was watching her. But before she could turn to leave, the door to the basement slammed shut behind her. The light on her phone flickered and went out completely, plunging her into darkness. Panic set in as she scrambled to find her way back to the door. Her breath was shallow, her body trembling with fear. Then she heard it, a whisper, faint at first but growing louder, coming from all around her. You shouldn't have opened it. She froze. The voice wasn't human. It was hollow, like a distant echo of something ancient and long forgotten. The shadows in the room began to shift. Sarah's flashlight flickered back on, but now the room looked different. The walls had transformed. The symbols were no longer just markings. They were alive, moving, crawling along the floor, the ceiling, the walls, as if they were a part of the very foundation of the building. Then the eyes appeared, dozens of them, eyes of every shape, every color, glowing in the darkness. They stared at her with an unnatural intensity, their gaze freezing her in place. You shouldn't have opened it, the voice repeated, now coming from everywhere, surrounding her. Suddenly, something grabbed her from behind, cold, clammy hands wrapping around her arms, pulling her back into the darkness. Her body went rigid, her mind screaming for release, but her voice wouldn't come. She tried to move, to run, but it was like the air itself was suffocating her, holding her in place. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The door to the basement flew open, and she was thrown out, landing hard on the floor of the lounge. The lights flickered back on, the basement as it had been before, quiet, normal, empty. Sarah scrambled to her feet, gasping for air, her heart hammering in her chest. Her phone was lying on the ground beside her, but the screen was cracked, displaying only static. The basement was silent now, and no one else was around. It was as if nothing had happened, but Sarah knew better. She could still feel it, the eyes, the voices, the shadows that hadn't truly left. She didn't tell anyone what happened. No one believed her, and even if they did, they wouldn't have understood. From that day on, Sarah stayed away from the basement, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, waiting. And sometimes, when she passed the door to the basement, she could still hear the faint whispering, "You shouldn't have opened it."
Story number 8.
It was the end of the semester at Hollowbrook High, and the halls were buzzing with excitement. Everyone was looking forward to the holidays, the break from classes, and the chance to unwind. But for a few students, the holidays would bring more than they bargained for. Maggie and her group of friends had been hearing rumors about the school's old auditorium. They had all heard stories about strange occurrences there, how the lights would flicker when no one was around, how the sound of piano music could be heard late at night, even though the keys hadn't been touched in years. Some even claimed to have seen shadows moving across the stage when the auditorium was empty, but none of them had ever dared to go inside. That all changed one chilly December evening. Maggie and her friends, a group of 6, decided they would explore the old auditorium once and for all. They had always thought the stories were just that, stories. But as they stood outside the rusted double doors of the auditorium, a cold breeze swept through the air, sending a shiver down their spines. The doors creaked open as if they had been waiting for them. The interior of the auditorium was even more eerie than they had imagined. The air was thick with dust, and the stage was cloaked in shadows, the empty seats stretching out in rows like forgotten memories. The walls were lined with old, peeling posters of past plays, some so faded they were barely legible. "Let's just get this over with," Maggie said, trying to sound brave. She could feel the weight of the place pressing in on her, the silence suffocating. They made their way toward the stage, their footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. The floorboards creaked beneath their weight, and the old velvet curtains hung loosely, stained and torn from years of neglect. But it was the piano that caught their attention. It sat in the far corner of the stage, a grand piano, covered in a thick layer of dust. The keys, yellowed with age, seemed almost inviting, as though it was waiting for someone to play. Maggie couldn't resist. She walked over to it, her friends trailing behind, whispering among themselves. As her fingers brushed the keys, a single haunting note filled the air. The sound reverberated through the empty hall, echoing off the walls in a way that made her skin crawl. The note lingered, hanging in the air before the entire piano seemed to shudder as if it were alive. "Did you hear that?" one of her friends whispered. "The piano just..." Before they could finish, the lights above them flickered and went out, plunging the auditorium into total darkness. Maggie's heart pounded in her chest, and she fumbled for her phone, trying to use the flashlight. That's when they heard it. A soft, melodic tune began to play from the piano. At first, it was faint, just a few notes, a haunting melody that seemed to swirl around them. But then it grew louder, more intense, as if someone were sitting at the piano, playing it with feverish urgency. It was a beautiful song, but it felt wrong. The melody was too perfect, too beautiful, and yet there was something in it that made Maggie's blood run cold. "Who's playing that?" her friend Rachel asked, her voice shaking. "It's just the wind," Maggie tried to reassure her, but even she didn't believe it. The music stopped abruptly, and in the silence that followed they heard something else, the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps, heavy steps, moving across the stage, dragging on the floor. "Who's there?" Maggie called out, her voice trembling. No one answered. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw something move. A figure, standing at the back of the stage, partially hidden in the shadows. At first, it looked like a person, tall, thin, and hunched over. But as it stepped forward, it became clear it wasn't human. Its face was pale, smooth, and featureless, save for its eyes. Black, hollow eyes that stared into them with an intensity that made Maggie feel as though her very soul was being pulled from her body. The figure took another step, and the floor groaned under its weight. The lights flickered again, and when they came back on, the figure was gone. But the music started again, this time louder, more frantic, as if someone were playing the piano with violent force. Maggie turned to her friends, but they were already backing away, their faces pale with fear. "We need to get out of here," Rachel whispered. The group turned and ran toward the exit, but the doors, those old, rusted doors, slammed shut with a deafening crash. The room was once again plunged into darkness, and the music became more frantic, louder, like it was closing in on them. Maggie's heart raced, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She turned back to the piano, and there, standing at the bench, was the figure once more, its hollow eyes staring straight at her. Its hands were moving over the keys, playing the same haunting song, but this time, its fingers were long, twisted, and unnaturally bent. It raised its head slowly, its mouth opening wide to reveal rows of sharp, jagged teeth, dripping with something dark. The lights flickered one last time, and then went out, plunging them into absolute blackness. When the group was found the next morning, the police discovered that all 6 students had vanished without a trace. The doors to the auditorium were found wide open, but there was no sign of a struggle, no trace of where they had gone. Their phones were scattered on the floor near the piano, but there was no footage, no messages, nothing to explain their disappearance. Some say that the piano still plays on its own late at night when the halls of Hollowbrook High are empty. The melody is beautiful, but it's always followed by the sound of dragging footsteps echoing through the school. And if you listen closely enough, you might hear a voice in the silence whispering,
Story number 9.
It was the middle of winter when the students of Ridgeway Academy began to notice strange things happening around the campus. Ridgeway was an old private school tucked deep in the woods, and though it had been around for over a century, no one really spoke of its past. The school's history was murky, filled with vague rumors and hushed whispers among the staff, but none of the students thought much of it until the day they discovered the locked room. It all started when a group of seniors, curious and bored on a Friday night, decided to explore the school's abandoned wing. The old wing had been closed off for years due to maintenance issues, but no one had ever bothered to check it out, as it was far from the rest of the school and surrounded by overgrown trees. No one knew exactly what was inside that part of the building, and everyone was fine leaving it that way. But on that particular night, things changed. Jason, the leader of the group, found the door to the abandoned wing while they were sneaking around after curfew. It was old and covered in dust, as if it hadn't been touched in decades, but the lock was surprisingly new. The curiosity was too much for Jason to resist. He pried open the door with the crowbar they had found earlier, and with a grin waved for his friends to follow. The group of 5 students made their way down the dark, narrow hall. The air was thick and cold, and it felt like the very walls were watching them. The further they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. Strange noises echoed around them, soft scraping sounds like something or someone moving just out of sight. "I don't like this," whispered Maria, one of the students. "Let's go back." But Jason was determined. He led them deeper into the building, past old classrooms filled with broken desks and torn papers. The silence was deafening, broken only by their footsteps and the occasional creak of the old building. They reached a small, unmarked door at the end of the hallway. The door was old, like the others, but it had a different feel to it. The moment they touched the handle, a chill ran through the group. "What is this place?" Jason asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He turned the handle and pushed the door open, revealing a small room, its only contents an old, dust-covered wooden chest. The room smelled of damp wood and something else, something faintly metallic, like rust. The chest sat in the center of the room, its lock rusted and worn. "Guys, should we really open it?" Maria asked, her voice shaking. But Jason, always the bravest, or maybe the most reckless, ignored her and lifted the chest's lid. The moment he did, a gust of cold air rushed from the chest, knocking everyone back. The room grew unbearably cold, and in the sudden rush of wind, the lights flickered, plunging the room into darkness for a brief moment. When the lights returned, the chest was still open, but something was wrong. Something was off. Jason reached inside, and when his hand emerged, he was holding a faded, yellowed photograph. It showed a group of students dressed in old-fashioned uniforms standing in front of the school. They were all smiling, but there was something about their smiles that didn't sit right. Their eyes seemed hollow, like they weren't really alive. "Who are they?" Maria asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jason turned the photo over. On the back, written in faded ink, were the words, "They'll never leave." Suddenly, the room felt even colder. The floor beneath them creaked, and from the corner of the room, they heard a low, guttural whisper. It was so faint, so distant, that at first they thought they were imagining it. But then it grew louder, like someone was standing just behind them. "You shouldn't have opened it." The voice was cold, full of malice, and it sent a chill down their spines. They spun around, but there was no one there. Only the darkness seemed to stare back at them. Then the door slammed shut. Trapped in the small windowless room, the group's panic grew. Jason, still holding the photograph, tried to open the door, but the handle wouldn't budge. They banged on the walls, yelled for help, but no sound reached outside. The silence was suffocating. That's when the shadows in the room started to move. At first it was subtle, a flicker in the corner of their eyes like someone darting between the walls. But then the shadows grew, darkening the corners, stretching across the floor. A shape began to form, tall, hunched, with elongated limbs and a face that was a dark, featureless void. It was standing in the corner, watching them. The whispers returned, this time from everywhere, filling the room. "You shouldn't have opened it. You shouldn't have disturbed us." One by one, the students began to panic. They screamed, their voices echoing in the suffocating silence. The creature in the corner seemed to grow taller, its limbs twisting as it moved closer. It reached out, its fingers long and twisted, just inches from their faces. Then the room went dark again. When the lights returned, the group was gone. The chest was still open, the photograph lying on the floor, but the room was empty. The next morning, Ridgeway Academy was abuzz with the disappearance of the 5 students. The police were called, but despite their best efforts, no trace of them was ever found. It was as if they had simply vanished into thin air. And yet, strange things began happening around the school. The students' faces began to appear in old photographs around the building, photos that no one had ever seen before. Their eyes, hollow and dark, stared back from the walls. Whispers could be heard in the halls, and sometimes when the lights flickered, you could almost see them, just for a moment, standing in the corners of the classrooms, watching. Some say that the old wing is still haunted by the students who opened the chest. They say the shadows never left, that the creature still lurks in the dark corners, waiting for the next group of students foolish enough to disturb its slumber. And if you happen to pass by that old locked door, you might hear it, the faintest whisper just before the lights go out.